My wife and her pastor parents planned to make me raise her lover's baby. They thought their perfect Thanksgiving dinner was for announcing the pregnancy. They didn't know I was serving divorce papers for the main course. You know, there's a specific kind of silence that only exists in a glass-walled office 50 floors above a sleeping city. It's not an absence of sound. It's the sound of being completely insulated from a world. The distant hum of the city below, the whisper of the climate control. It's the soundtrack of success, I used to think. The sound of control. On that particular Tuesday night, the sound was especially sweet. I just closed the biggest logistics contract of my career. A multi-year, 8-figure deal that would cement my family's company, now in its third generation, as the undisputed leader in the region. I leaned back in my leather chair, the one that had been my father's, and looked out at the grid of lights stretching to the horizon. I was 41 years old. I had built upon my father's legacy and multiplied it tenfold. I had the respect of my peers, the loyalty of my employees, and at home, I had Genevieve, my beautiful, vibrant Jen. Everything I did, everything I built was for her. When we first married, she'd idly sketched a house on a napkin, a sprawling modern farmhouse with a wraparound porch and big windows to let the light in. A year later, I had it built for her on a 20-acre plot just outside of town, every detail exactly as she dreamed it. When she mentioned she missed riding, I didn't just get her a horse. I imported a thoroughbred from Kentucky and built a stable that looked like it belonged on a postcard. The European vacations, the surprise weekend trips, the endless stream of gifts. I saw it all as tangible proof of my love. Bricks and mortar, airline tickets, and velvet boxes. That's how a man like me says I love you. By providing. By building a fortress of a life so perfect that no harm could ever breach its walls. I thought back to the beginning before all this. Before the company tripled in size, before the house on the hill. I remember a night, maybe 6 months after we were married, at the company depot. It was late, the lot empty under the stark orange glow of the security lights. On a whim, I'd lifted her into the driver's seat of a brand new Kenworth semi. She was swimming in a captain's chair, her feet barely reaching the pedals. I stood on the running board, leaning in through the open door, my hands over hers on the massive steering wheel, showing her how to shift through the gears. Her laughter, pure and uninhibited, echoed across the empty asphalt as we lurched and stalled our way across the lot. There was no money in that moment, no status. There was just us, two people stealing a moment of simple, uncomplicated joy. That was the foundation, I told myself. That was the truth of us. The drive home was quiet. I was tired but filled with that deep, bone-settling satisfaction that comes from a hard-won victory. I pictured telling Jen about the deal. She'd feign interest in the details, her eyes glazing over at the talk of freight lanes and tonnage, but she'd be proud. Then she'd pour us both a glass of the good scotch and steer the conversation towards something more exciting, like the charity gala she was helping to organize. When I pulled into our long gravel driveway, the house was lit up, warm and inviting. But as I walked in, I found Genevieve in the living room, not with a celebratory drink, but with a Cartier box on the coffee table in front of her. It was the watch I'd given her for our 5th anniversary 2 weeks prior. She was just sitting there, staring at it. "Hey, you," I said, loosening my tie. "Everything okay?" She looked up, and for a fleeting second, I saw something in her eyes I couldn't name. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of profound weariness. Then it was gone, replaced by the bright smile I knew so well. "Silas, you're home early." She stood and kissed me, her lips cool. "I was just looking at this. It's almost too beautiful to wear." "Nothing's too beautiful for you," I said, pulling her close. I told her about the contract, about the victory. She played her part perfectly, squeezed my hand, told me how brilliant I was, how proud she was. But her eyes kept drifting back to the velvet box on the table. "It's beautiful, see," she said later, as we got ready for bed. Her voice was quiet, her back to me as she brushed her hair at her vanity. As always, there was something in the way she said it. As always, as if my grand gestures had become routine, predictable, like the sun rising in the east. reliable, impressive, and ultimately taken for granted. I brushed the feeling aside. I was tired, reading into things. We had a perfect life. I was the architect of that life. It was solid. It was safe. 2 weeks later, the first wrecking ball hit. It came in the form of a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Silas, it's Chloe, Genevieve's friend. I need to talk to you. It's important. And it's not something I can say on the phone. Chloe. I racked my brain. She was one of Jen's newer friends, part of the equestrian crowd. All I knew about her was that she was always in some kind of financial jam, always talking about her next big idea that never seemed to materialize. I agreed to meet her at a diner off the interstate, a grimy place with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of stale coffee. It was a world away from the clean, orderly lines of my life. She slid into the booth opposite me, looking strung out. Her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. Thanks for coming, she mumbled, not meeting my eyes. What's this about, Chloe? She took a long drag. I'm in trouble, Silas. Bad trouble. I owe some people money. $50,000. I almost laughed. And you think I'm an ATM? You need to talk to Jen. Jen's the one who got me into this, she said, her voice dropping. She's the one who introduced me to my bookie. She gets a thrill from the risk, watching other people play. The statement hung in the air, ugly and incongruous. Jen? My Jen, who chaired charity committees and planned elegant parties. I don't believe you, I said flatly. You don't have to. She reached in her worn-out purse and pulled out a thin, cheap folder. She slid it across the sticky tabletop. Look, I know what you think of me. But your wife? She's playing a much bigger game. I'm just here to cash out. My hand was steady as I opened the folder. My world was not. Inside were 2 items. The first was a photocopy of a key card receipt from the Elysian Hotel downtown, a hotel I often use for business meetings. The date was from 3 weeks ago, a night I was in Chicago closing a preliminary deal. The second item was a photograph. Grainy, obviously taken with a phone from a distance. But there was no mistaking the people in it. Genevieve, my wife, was leaning into the passenger window of a dark green Range Rover, her hands cupping the face of the man inside. She was kissing him, a deep, passionate kiss that spoke of familiarity and hunger. I knew the man. Of course I knew him. Everyone in town did. It was Dr. Jason Cooper, the handsome, charming town veterinarian, the man who cared for Jen's 6-figure horse. My perfect fortress had just been breached, and I had a sickening feeling that this was just the first crack in the wall. The drive back from the diner was a blur. I don't remember the traffic, the turns, the familiar landmarks of the town I'd lived in my whole life. All I could see was that grainy photograph burned onto the back of my eyelids. When I got home, the house was silent. Genevieve was out for the evening at one of her charity functions, a detail that now seemed sinister. I went to my safe, my hands moving with a strange, robotic calm, and pulled out $50,000 in cash. It felt like nothing, just paper. An entrance fee to a horror show I was being forced to attend. I met Chloe again, this time in a deserted parking lot. I gave her half the money. She handed me a small, black USB drive. The rest when you've seen it all, she said, her eyes fixated on the cash. And Silas? Don't hate me. Hate her. She's the one who made the movie. That night, I locked myself in my home office. With the city lights spread out below me like a blanket of distant, indifferent stars, I plugged the USB drive in my laptop. The folder that opened was labeled, Simply the Truth. It contained hundreds of files. Texts, photos, short video clips, audio recordings. It was a digital autopsy of my marriage. I clicked open the first file. A string of text messages between Jen and Jason, going back 8 months. Her, he's leaving for Denver on Thursday. The house is all ours. Winky face. Him, can't wait. Wear that black dress I like. Him, thinking about you. Stuck in a boring appointment with a Henderson's ancient golden retriever. Her, poor baby. I can think of better things for you to do with your hands. I felt a wave of nausea, so intense, I had to grip the edge of my desk. I read on, my heart turning to a block of ice in my chest. They mocked me. They called me the clueless workhorse, the golden goose. They joked about my work trips, my long hours, the very success I had built for her. It was all just a convenience, a backdrop for their sordid little play. Then I saw the pictures. Selfies of them in hotel rooms, the same ones I'd stayed in on business trips. A picture of them drinking wine on my porch, taken one afternoon when I was in a 14-hour meeting marathon. There were videos Chloe had secretly recorded on her phone during girls' nights, where Jen would be laughing with her friends while texting Jason under the table, her face alight with a kind of giddy, cruel excitement I hadn't seen in years. Then I found a conversation that broke me. Her, I think I'm going to have to tell him soon. Starting to show a little. Him, what are you going to tell him? Her, that it's his, obviously. He's been wanting kids forever. He'll be so excited he won't even do the math. The words swam before my eyes. He won't even do the math. The cold, calculating cruelty of it stole the air from my lungs. The baby she had started hinting about, the one I had allowed a flicker of hope to ignite for in my own heart. It was all part of the lie, the ultimate deception. My mind, unbidden, flashed back to a memory from years ago. A sudden summer storm had broken a section of fence in the back pasture. We'd run out together in the pouring rain to fix it, just the two of us. We were soaked, covered in mud, laughing as we struggled with the posts and wire. She'd looked at me, her face streaked with rain and dirt, her eyes shining with pure, uncomplicated love, and said, This is real." I slammed the laptop shut, a strangled cry escaping my lips. The man in that memory and the man sitting in this sterile office were two different people. That man's world had been real. My world, I now knew, was an elaborate, beautifully constructed fraud. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. It was sharp, it was searing, and it lasted for a full hour as I sat there in the dark. And then it was gone, replaced by something else. Something cold, clear, and terrifyingly calm. The grief had burned away, and what was left was purpose. I spent the rest of the night meticulously going through every file, not as a husband, but as an auditor. I organized the files by date, cross-referencing texts with credit card statements I pulled up online. The weekend she was at a spa retreat with friends, a $1,200 charge at a boutique hotel in Memphis. The business lunch where she networked, a charge for two at a fancy restaurant across town, time-stamped on a day I knew Jason Cooper had no appointments. Then I found the unholy grail, a separate folder labeled Family. It was her conversations with her parents, Pastor Robert and his perfect wife, Susan, the moral pillars of our community, the people who had prayed over our marriage at our wedding. Jen, Mom, I'm freaking out. Chloe knows about Jason and me. What she tells Silas? Susan, don't you worry, honey. Your father will handle it. Just be more discreet. Jen, Dad, the situation, it's getting more complicated. I think I'm pregnant. Pastor Robert, we will navigate this storm as a family. I've been thinking. The Lord teaches forgiveness, but also prudence. For now, it is a blessing that Silas believes is his. It will provide stability until Dr. Cooper can arrange his own affairs. Consider it a penance for your choices. The alternative is a public scandal that would do irreparable damage to this family and my ministry. There it was, the full, monstrous plan laid out in the sanctimonious language of a man who preached about truth from a pulpit every Sunday. Use me. Use my love, my desire for a family, my trust. Use me as a cover, a placeholder, until the real father could shed his own wife and family. Let me love and bond with a child that was not mine, only to have it all ripped away later at their convenience. All to protect a reputation. All to keep the collection plates full. The sun was starting to rise, casting a pale, gray light into the room. I hadn't slept. I didn't feel tired. I felt forged. The man who had entered this office 12 hours ago was gone. He was a casualty of the truth. In his place was someone else, someone I was just getting to know. My first call was not to a divorce lawyer in our county. That would be too easy to trace. My first call was to Arthur Vance. He had been my father's lawyer, and now he was mine. More than that, he had been my father's best friend. He was 70 years old, sharp as a razor, and the only man on earth I trusted implicitly. We met that afternoon in his wood-paneled office in the city, an hour's drive away. I didn't speak much. I just opened my laptop, plugged in the USB drive, and let him read. I watched his face shift from grandfatherly concern to stony silence, and then to a slow, simmering rage that mirrored my own. When he was done, he closed the laptop and looked at me, his eyes hard. "Well, son," he said, his voice low, "it appears we have a snake pit to clean out." "I want to ruin them, Arthur," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I don't want to just divorce her. I want to dismantle their entire world. Their reputation, their standing, their money. I want to leave them with nothing but the truth of what they are." Arthur nodded slowly. "They've treated your life, your legacy, like a hostile takeover. We will respond in kind. We will prepare a final audit, and I assure you, they're emotionally and financially bankrupt. We just need to make it official." He laid out the plan. First, a top-tier private investigator to gather fresh, untainted evidence. We couldn't rely on a blackmailer like Chloe in a legal setting. Second, a forensic accountant to create an undeniable paper trail of the marital funds used to finance the affair. Third, the slow, methodical transfer of my personal assets and premarital holdings into protected accounts. And Silas, Arthur said, his gaze unwavering. "For the next few weeks, you have the hardest job of all. You go home. You play the part. You be the loving husband. You be the excited father-to-be. You give them no reason to suspect the storm is coming." So I went home, and the performance of my life began. For the next 2 weeks, I was a ghost in my own life, playing the part of man I no longer was, living with a woman who was a stranger to me. The tension was a living thing in the house. Every meal was a scene. Every conversation was a line of dialogue. Genevieve was in full bloom with her secret. She'd started wearing looser clothes, complaining of morning sickness, all for my benefit. One evening, she curled up next to me on the couch, her head on my chest. "I've been thinking about names," she whispered. "If it's a boy, what about Samuel? After your father?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Samuel, my dad. The man who had taught me the value of honesty and hard work. The man whose name these people would so casually use to further their lie. I felt a surge of rage, so pure, so hot, I thought I would suffocate. I forced myself to breathe. I stroked her hair, my touch a parody of affection. "I love it," I whispered, the words tasting like acid in my mouth. The most difficult moment came a few nights later. I was working late, and she fell asleep on the couch, waiting for me. For a moment, with her face relaxed in sleep, she looked like the girl I had married. The girl who had laughed in the rain, who had dreamed of a life with me. A wave of profound, gut-wrenching sadness washed over me. The life we could have had, the family we could have been. It was all a ghost. A phantom limb that ached with a loss so deep it was bottomless. I walked over and gently pulled a cashmere throw over her. It was a final, instinctual act of a love that was already dead and buried. It was a farewell, not to her, but to the man I had been, the man who had loved her. He was gone now, and the man who remained had work to do. The week of Thanksgiving arrived with a cold snap that turned a world brittle and sharp. The final reports from a private investigator and the forensic accountant landed on Arthur's desk. They were everything we expected and more. Ironclad, timestamps, surveillance photos, bank transfers. A meticulously documented chronicle of deceit. Arthur's legal team worked swiftly, drafting the petition for dissolution of marriage. It wasn't a simple divorce filing. It was a tactical nuke, citing adultery, paternity fraud, and a civil conspiracy claim that named Robert and Susan Johnson as co-conspirators. The venue for the final act was never in doubt. Thanksgiving at the pastor's house. It was the social event of the season for their inner circle, a command performance of piety and prosperity. This year, I knew Genevieve and her parents were planning a special announcement during the pre-dinner prayer. The joyous news of their first grandchild. The timing was poetry. The night before Thanksgiving, I sat alone in my silent office, the city lights a cold comfort. The prepared envelopes, one for Genevieve, one for her parents, and a courtesy copy for Dr. Cooper, were laid out on my desk like tactical instruments. A wave of doubt, cold and unsettling, washed over me for the first time. The plan felt righteous in the abstract, but its execution felt monstrous. Was I becoming as cold and calculating as them? Was this really justice, or just a more elaborate form of cruelty? I picked up the phone and dialed Arthur. He answered on the second ring. "Everything is ready, Silas," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I know," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Arthur, tell me again why this is the right thing to do." There was a pause. I could hear the faint clink of ice in a glass. "Because, son," he said, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its steel, "some people build their lives on lies. They create a structure so rotten that it threatens to collapse and poison everything around it. You aren't destroying a family. You are condemning a building that was built on a toxic foundation. It's a necessary demolition. You are choosing truth. They chose the lie. Don't ever forget that. Are we the villains in this story, Arthur?" I asked, the question hanging in the air. "No, son," he replied firmly. "We are the consequences. There's a difference." I hung up the phone, my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He was right. I wasn't the villain. I was the reckoning. Thanksgiving Day dawned bright and painfully clear. I put on my best suit, the one I saved for weddings and funerals. It seemed appropriate for a day that would be both. Genevieve was a vision of glowing, maternal bliss. She wore a deep emerald green dress, elegant and just tight enough to hint at the small swell of her belly, the belly that held another man's child. The service at the First Baptist Church was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The pews were packed with the town's elite. Pastor Robert stood at the pulpit, his voice booming with false sincerity as he spoke of gratitude, family bonds, and the sacred trust between a husband and a wife. He even looked at me, a benevolent smile on his face as he said it. I met his gaze and held it, my expression a perfect mask of placid devotion. I could feel Genevieve's hand find mine, her skin warm. It felt like a snake coiling around my wrist. By 1:30, the inner circle was assembled at the pastor's house. The air was thick with the smell of roasting turkey and self-satisfaction. I saw the whole cast, church elders, major donors, and the year's special guests, a wealthy family considering a large donation for a new youth center. And there, by the fireplace, were Dr. Jason Cooper and his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor was a quiet, gentle woman who ran the church's Sunday school. She was talking with Susan, smiling, completely unaware that her world was about to be set on fire. I moved through the room, a ghost at the feast, my ears ringing with the polite chatter. At 1:55 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't know. "Alpha is in position, awaiting your signal." It was the process server Arthur had hired, a retired state trooper with a flair for the dramatic. I texted back a single word: "Execute." A few minutes later, Pastor Robert stood at the head of the long, beautifully set dining table. He raised his hands for silence. "My dear friends, my family," he began, his voice radiating warmth. "Before we partake in this wonderful meal, I'd like to say a few words of thanks. This year, we have a very special blessing to be grateful for." Right on cue, the doorbell rang, a loud, insistent chime that cut through the reverent silence. Susan started to get up. "Oh dear, who could that be?" "I'll get it," I said, standing up quickly. All eyes turned to me. Pastor Robert waved me down. No, Silas, you sit. I'm sure it's just a late arrival." He walked to the large oak door, still beaming. We heard him open it, his voice welcoming. "Hello, can I help you?" Then, a new voice, clear and professional, devoid of any festive cheer. "I am looking for Rebecca Mitchell Silas, Robert Johnson, and Susan Johnson." The pastor's welcoming tone vanished. "I'm sorry. We're in the middle of a family dinner." "I understand that, sir. This will only take a moment." The room was dead quiet. Pastor Robert's back was rigid as he stepped aside. In the doorway stood a tall, impassive man in a dark suit, holding a stack of large manila envelopes. "Rebecca Mitchell Silas," the man said, his voice projecting into the silent room. Genevieve stood up, her face a mask of confusion. He stepped forward and handed her the largest envelope. "Robert and Susan Johnson." He handed 2 more envelopes to the pastor, who took them automatically, his smile frozen on his face. "You have all been served." The server then turned his head slightly. "Dr. Cooper, this is a courtesy copy for you, sir." Your wife will be served separately. He walked over and placed the final envelope on the table directly in front of Jason, whose face had gone a ghostly white. The server gave a curt nod. "Have a nice day." And then he was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth out of the room. Genevieve tore open her envelope, her hands shaking. Her eyes scanned the first page, the petition for dissolution of marriage, and then shot up to meet mine. Her face crumpled in disbelief. "Silas, what is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I stood up slowly, making sure I had everyone's attention. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "I believe the technical term is petition for dissolution of marriage," I said, my voice calm and clear. "On the grounds of adultery and paternity fraud. There are also copies for your parents, since they're named as co-conspirators in the civil fraud claim." A collective gasp went through the room. Pastor Robert was ripping at his own envelope, his face turning a mottled shade of red and purple. Susan looked like she had turned to stone. And just so everyone is clear on the facts, I continued, pulling a small, high-quality audio recorder from my jacket pocket. I placed it on the table and pressed play. Genevieve's voice, clear as a bell, filled the silent room. It was a recording from the PI surveillance. Her talking on the phone with Jason. "Don't worry. He'll be so excited he won't even do the math. He'll think it's his." The sound cut off, but the words hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. That's when Eleanor, Jason's wife, let a sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a low, guttural gasp of pain, of a soul being torn in two. "What baby?" she choked out, turning to her husband. "Jason, what is he talking about?" Jason looked like a cornered animal. I can explain." "Explain what?" I asked, my voice still level. "Explain how you've been sleeping with my wife for the better part of a year? How you're the father of the child she's carrying? Or how her parents, the moral compass of this town, helped orchestrate the entire cover-up? This is an outrage." Pastor Robert finally roared, finding his voice. "Lies. Slander. How dare you?" I actually laughed. A short, sharp, humorless sound. "Accusations? You're holding the proof in your hands, Pastor. Check Exhibit C, page 27. It's the transcript of your text messages advising your daughter on how to be more discreet. Pretty detailed for accusations, don't you think?" He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. The look of utter, impotent fury on his face was worth every penny, every sleepless night. Genevieve was staring at me, her face a mess of tears and rage. How could you?" Then her eyes darted around the room and landed on Chloe, who was standing near the back, calmly recording the entire scene on her phone. "You!" Genevieve shrieked. "You did this!" Chloe just gave a tiny, unapologetic shrug. The room began to dissolve into chaos. Eleanor, with a sudden, primal scream, grabbed the heavy, porcelain gravy boat from the table and threw it at her husband, catching him squarely in the forehead. He stumbled back, a dark line of gravy and blood trickling down his face. Guests were scrambling from their chairs, pushing toward the door. I stood there for one more moment, a calm island in the hurricane of my own making. I let the scene burn itself into my memory. The shattered illusion, the collapsed artifice, the raw, ugly truth laid bare on the fine linen tablecloth. I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't run. I walked. I could hear Susan finally break, her sobs loud and hysterical. I could hear the crash of a chair being knocked over. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. I walked out of that house and didn't stop. I got into my truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the cacophony of shattered lives behind me. The sounds of screaming and crying faded until all I could hear was the hum of the engine and the rush of my own blood in my ears. By the time I hit the highway, my phone was exploding. A relentless barrage of texts and calls. "Jen, how could you do this to me? To us? Jen, we need to talk. Please come back. Jen, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please." Voicemails from Pastor Robert, his voice evolving from threatening to pleading. One from Susan, so hysterical with sobs I could barely make out the words. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the empty highway, the red taillights of my truck bleeding into the darkness. I held the phone in my hand for a long moment, then I powered it off. The sudden silence was vast and absolute. I put the truck in gear and kept driving. I drove for 3 hours, heading west into the night, until I crossed the state line. I checked into a nondescript motel, a place of transient anonymity where no one knew my name. The room smelled of bleach and regret. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the chaos I had unleashed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt hollow, empty, like a building after a demolition, all dust and ringing silence where something once stood. Later that night, I briefly turned my phone back on. A single text message came through. It was from Chloe. Holy hell, Silas. It was a bloodbath. Eleanor threw the entire gravy boat. The pastor's biggest donor walked out and called half the church board on his way to his car. Best Thanksgiving ever. The rest of the money hit my account. Thanks, boss. I stared at the message, then deleted it and turned the phone off again. I lay back on the lumpy mattress and stared at the water-stained ceiling. For the first time in 8 months, I slept without dreaming. The days that followed were a blur of legal correspondence handled through Arthur. I never spoke to any of them again. Arthur was my shield, my weapon. The divorce was swift and brutal. Faced with incontrovertible evidence of fraud, Genevieve's legal challenges crumbled. She was left with nothing but her personal effects, a mountain of debt, and the child that was not mine. The fallout in the town was, as Arthur put it, biblical. The story of the Thanksgiving takedown became a local legend. Pastor Robert was forced to resign in disgrace by the church board. The Johnson family sold their big house at a loss and moved out of state, disappearing into ignominy. Dr. Cooper's veterinary practice collapsed. His wife, Eleanor, divorced him, taking him for everything she could. Their perfect lives, built on a foundation of lies, had been reduced to rubble. I never went back. Arthur handled the sale of the house, the stables, the land. I sold my majority stake in the company to a national conglomerate, setting up my loyal employees with generous severance and retirement packages. I kept enough to be comfortable, but I didn't want the empire anymore. It was part of a life that no longer belonged to me. A year later, I was living in a small town on the Oregon coast, a place where the sky was often gray and the ocean was a constant, churning presence. The air smelled of salt and pine, not money and lies. I had started a small company, a specialized freight service with only 3 trucks, focusing on transporting fragile, high-value art and antiques. It was quiet work, honest work. One afternoon, I was on the phone with a new client, a gallery owner in Seattle. We were finalizing the details of a shipment. So, Silas, she said, her voice friendly, do you have family? We're family business ourselves. It's always nice to know who you're working with. I paused, looking out my office window at the gray waves crashing on the shore. The question, so simple, so innocent, hung in the air. For a moment, I saw a ghost, a woman's laugh in a semi-truck, a shared smile in the rain. No, I said finally, my voice even. It's just me. The words didn't hold the sting they once would have. They were just a fact. The final line in a ledger that was now closed. That evening, I walked down to the beach. The sun was setting, a fiery gash in the cloudy sky. I stood on the wet sand, the cold wind whipping at my face, and watched the tide come in. I hadn't just exposed a lie that day at Thanksgiving. I had liberated myself from it. The victory wasn't in their destruction, but in my own survival. I had burned my old life to the ground, and from the ashes, I had walked away. I was not the same man who had built that perfect fortress. That man was gone forever. But the man who stood there now, watching the endless ocean, was free. And for the first time, he understood the profound, solemn, and quiet cost of what that freedom was worth.